Well, good morning, everybody. Pastor Steve here. Thank you for joining me for this devotion, whether you're watching the video or listening to the podcast. I really do appreciate it. Pray it's a blessing in your life. As you're watching this or listening to it, Monisa and I are actually in California. I recorded this back in May, but we've been in Anaheim, California, attending the annual meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention. Also spending a couple of weeks vacationing with our daughter, Jacqueline, and her family. They live in San Pedro, just outside of L.A., and so we're hanging out with them. And if you want to follow with what's going on, just follow me on Instagram at Steve. What do you call that under dash thing? That low dash, not the hyphen, but underneath, underline, under dash, whatever, lower dash. You techies know what I'm talking about. So Steve, that under whatever that is, Hogg, and you can find me on Instagram. Matt will put it on the screen so that my gibberish will make sense to you. However, today in our devotion, we are in Judges chapter 2. Judges chapter 2. And as I mentioned yesterday, Judges chapter 1 and chapter 2 really are two different introductions to the book of Judges. What starts in chapter 3. Chapter 1 is kind of an overview of the military success and failures from a historical perspective, and chapter 2 is more of a spiritual view, looking at those events through God's eyes. And so you read about Joshua dying twice. Now, let me just make it clear. Joshua did not die twice. Since the chapter 1 is an introduction from the military perspective, you have the death of Joshua recorded. In chapter 2, since it's an overview of it from a spiritual perspective through the eyes of God, the same event, so to speak, you have Joshua dying, his death recorded there. So only died once, but both of these are introductions, so I hope that helps you a little bit. And chapter 3 starts with the future after Joshua's death. Now, Israel's problem, which was pointed out yesterday in chapter 1 of not driving all the people out, not fully obeying God, is detailed in chapter 2, but through God's eyes. Because in chapter 1, all it says is they didn't drive all the people out, or they made them forced labor, or they let them live there, they didn't conquer all the land. Well, that's just the story of what happened. Chapter 2, all right, what does God think about it? How does God see it? Okay? Now, in chapter 2, in verse 10, we are told that all the generation, this is the generation that was alive when Joshua was alive and died, and then shortly after he died, the elders that were still alive. He said, but when all of that generation died, there arose another generation, so their heirs, if you will, another generation after them who did not know the Lord, nor yet the work which he had done for Israel. Even after Joshua died, the elders who had lived through it with Joshua were still able to talk about the things God had done because they had experienced it. But after they died, it's like people started forgetting all God had done. And as they lost touch with the work of God, they lost touch with God himself, their relationship with God. And so you have this looked at spiritually in verse 11. Here's what happened. The sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. That's the idols and the pagan religions of the Canaanites that they allowed to remain in the promised land after they conquered it. So the influence of the people they let stay showed up very quickly as they started mixing the worship of God, Yahweh, with Baal, the pagan god idols of the Canaanites. It was a syncretistic approach of blending the religions. In verse 14, the anger of the Lord burned against Israel, and he gave them into the hands of plunderers who plundered them. And he sold them into the hands of their enemies around them. What would happen, and the rest of Judges tells the story, that different tribes, different parts of the promised land would be conquered by Canaanites and other people groups because they were turning their back on God. And so God said, I'm going to do to you what I had said I would do to the inhabitants of the land when I gave it to you. And so now they're being conquered at different times. And then in verses 16 and 17, the Lord raised up judges. Now, by judges, it doesn't mean somebody who sits on the bench of a court. The Hebrew word is it's a heroic ruler who sets things right. They were called a judge because they made right things that were wrong. So verse 16, the Lord raised up judges who delivered them from the hands of those who plundered them. So one tribe or a couple of tribes or one part of the promised land, the Jewish people would be troubled or conquered by some of the outlying nations or the inhabitants, and they would cry out to God, and he would raise up a judge who would deliver them. In chapters 3 and following, the judges tells all the stories. So here's a summation of what's going to be happening, what we're going to be reading about starting in chapter 3. Then he says in verse 17, every time God raised up a judge to deliver them, yet they did not listen to their judges, for they played the harlot after other gods. There's this analogy of adultery, of prostitution, that they were unfaithful to God when they would worship these pagan gods. And then verse 19, but it came about when the judge died that they would turn back and act more corruptly than their fathers in following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not abandon their practices or their stubborn ways. Remember, we read in Numbers yesterday that God told Moses to tell them, when you conquer the promised land, remove all the inhabitants, destroy everything that has anything to do with their pagan worship. They did not do that. Even though, as we said yesterday, it looked like obedience and success because they conquered the land and made many of them their forced laborers, slavery. It was actually failure and disobedience and sin. And here he says that what happens, and we read about it throughout the book of Judges, and it covers a period of centuries, that one failure, that one disobedience, when they conquered the promised land, would haunt them for the rest of their nation's existence. Now, some lessons real quickly. One, godly leaders matter. Joshua and the elders that were alive during Joshua's time, the people were fairly faithful, not completely faithful, but fairly faithful during those years. But as soon as those leaders died, man, they turned their back on God and started worshiping the Baals, these pagan gods. God would raise up a judge, things would get a little better, but they still wouldn't listen to the judge. And if the judge died, they went right back to the old ways, but even worse, their sinful ways. Godly leaders are important and they are needed, but godly leaders and strong leaders and visionary leaders are not the only thing that's needed. People need to listen to God and obey Him. It doesn't matter how good, strong, or godly the leader is, if the people will not listen to God and obey God, it doesn't work. And one last thing. God does not always give us total victory in life at one time. Sometimes He stretches it out, if you will. But there's always a reason. At the end of chapter 2, verses 21 to 23, look at it. I also will no longer drive out before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, in order to test Israel by them, by those inhabitants, whether they will keep the way of the Lord to walk in it, as their fathers did or not. So the Lord allowed those nations to remain, not driving them out quickly, and He did not give them into the hands of Joshua. God did not give the Jewish people all the promised land all at once. And part of that was to test them, would they be faithful over the long haul? See, sometimes God gives us blessings and He gives us victory, but it's not full. It's limited, it's partial. Because God wants to see, what are you going to do? Are you going to be faithful during the partial victory? Or are you only going to be faithful if you get it all at the same time on your timeline? Are you going to be faithful to God through it all? Through it all. Even when you have to wait for some of the victory to come. A couple of the lessons tomorrow we jump into chapter 3. Look forward to that. God bless you, and I'll see you then.